His significant collection of self-taught and outsider art is an important feature of the Milwaukee Art Museum. Anthony Petullo is my special guest next on I Remember. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember. Joining me tonight is Anthony Petullo, an avid art collector. He gifted more than 300 drawings, paintings, and sculptures to a museum now celebrating 125 years of art. Take a look.
When Anthony Petullo gifted his collection to the Milwaukee Art Museum in 2010, it added to the prestige of a museum with a long history in the city. The legacy started in 1888 with Frederick Layton's collection. That's when the civic leader opened the Layton Art Gallery downtown at Mason and Jefferson. In 1920, the Layton School of Art was formed at the same location. The Milwaukee Art Institute was just up the street. When Eero Saarinen designed the War Memorial Center at the lakefront, Milwaukee's Art Center moved in as well in 1957. It expanded with the Kaler Edition in 1975. Santiago Calatrava designed the Quadracci Pavilion, which opened in 2001. Anthony Petullo became involved with the Friends of Art in the early 1970s through the Lakefront Festival of Arts, an annual fundraising event that started in 1963. He spent over 3 decades accumulating a vast collection of self-taught and outsider art. He was drawn by the personal stories of the artists, many without formal training, as well as the art. Included are works by an American who was born a slave, a man who lived his entire life on the Irish coast, as well as artists who had spent time in an asylum. A number of European artists are also represented. The 2012 exhibition, Accidental Genius, drew crowds to the museum to see the Petullo collection. A retired entrepreneur and longtime member of the museum's board of directors, Petullo's gift has made the Milwaukee Art Museum a top American institution for self-taught art.
What is outsider art?
That is a very highly debatable term.
Really?
The world over. It's essentially, in the purest form, it's essentially people who do art just for themselves. There is no mimicry from other artists. They almost always do the same work at the beginning of their career as at the end of their career.
Really? So you don't find the progression that you'd
Nope.
find in a Picasso or Gauguin or somebody?
Picasso's a very good example. He did almost everything. He tried everything.
Oh, yeah.
But these folks really started doing art for their own enjoyment. And some were commercial, but didn't make very much money, and someone else usually helped them.
That's pretty much true of every artist I've ever read about. There are very few. There are few of the Impressionists that did well in their lifetime, but most of them, there's nothing till they died.
Some died as paupers.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I don't think Van Gogh ever made any money.
Probably not. Actually, Van Gogh and Gauguin were called self-taught artists.
Really?
But they really weren't, because they learned from each other. They learned from other artists. They watched other artists and they copied their techniques.
Well, all those guys kind of lived and worked together, didn't they?
Yes, they did. But they're not the same as these artists. In fact, one of my artists, Scotty Wilson, was actually collected by Picasso and Dubuffet.
Seriously?
And they, in Chicago, Imagists collect many of the artists that are in my collection. And it's the artist, the trained artist, who most appreciated the work of the self-taught.
Talk a little bit about Scotty Wilson, because he's kind of a fascinating character, and I think you got to know him, didn't you?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
No, he died before I started collecting, but he was born in the 1880s. He dropped out of school when he was 9. He worked with his little older brother, and they were selling newspapers and anything they could hawk in Glasgow, Scotland. And by the time he was 14 or 15, he was in the Scottish Rifles, served in India, South Africa, bought his way out of the army, which you had to do at the time to buy yourself out, wound up back in Scotland, and then World War I broke out. He rejoined and was in France because he couldn't get a job, and he was already trained. After the war, he was back, and Churchill has started what was called the Black and Tans, the problems with the Irish. And there was terrorism on both sides. Well, these servicemen from World War I were recruited. In fact, they actually had an office in Glasgow and in London, and they recruited these servicemen to be black, and they called Black and Tans because they were combination uniforms of part police officer in the tan and part military uniform. Anyway, he went on to be in this Black and Tans for a while, wound up in Canada, and then came back after all that was over, and was hawking his wares in London and back to Canada, and that's when he discovered his talent. He was drawing on a card table in the back of his junk shop in Toronto in 1935, and some folks saw it who appreciated art and said, this is really good. So he sold his junk shop, he actually gave it to his friend, and went across Canada, Vancouver, Winnipeg, and making drawings, sold what he did, what he had to make a living, came back to Toronto, and a man who was working with a new artist gave him 3 shows in 1943, 44, and 45, and he was very successful in Canada.
So he was in his 60s by this time?
He was...
or pushing 60s?
Just, yes. He was getting, well, he was in his 45, so he's in his 50s by that time. And when the war ended, he went back to London, and he was hawking his work to galleries, and one dealer really liked his drawings. So he said, but I'm mounting a show right now, and the catalog's finished, and it was of surrealists, Picasso, Moreau, and all of that bunch. And he said, but I'll put you in the back room. And from that point on, everybody thought that Scotty was part of that group.
That he was part of the major exhibition.
But actually, he was collected by, he'd already been collecting, Dubuffet had already been collecting his work, and a friend of mine took Scotty at Dubuffet's request to Paris and said, bring your portfolio with you. And at the house was Picasso.
Wow.
And I write about that in my book.
I mean, to walk into the room and
there was Picasso and Dubuffet fighting over his drawings.
Wow. So did he end up making money?
He had a suitcase full of cash under his bed when he died, and the equivalent of the IRS in London had already interviewed him.
Well, that doesn't sound very good.
He had never paid taxes.
Ever?
Ever.
And he kept it all in a suitcase.
Yeah, yep. And he was a real miser. He just wouldn't spend. He lived in one room wherever. He lived in boarding houses. Never had a telephone. I went to British Telecom, looked for a telephone for him under his former name, which was Freeman, Louis Freeman. He changed his name when he was in Canada to Scotty Wilson, Robert Wilson, and there was no trail to him. And I finally found more at the V&A and the Tate Museum, and then in Edinburgh Museum, they had quite a collection of whatever he had in his room when he died.
Wow. But the sort of the story you tell about him, though, being just say an offbeat type person.
Yeah, he was.
It seems to be very common.
Yes.
In the outsiders.
Many of them were very poor. Many were elderly, and their either husbands or wives had died. Bill Traylor, who was born a slave in Alabama, worked on a trailer plantation. After the Civil War and abolition, he became a sharecropper for the trailers. And when all the trailers died out, he moved to Montgomery and lived in the back of a funeral home. And he'd sit out in front of the funeral home and draw pictures of the people on the street and his memories of the plantation animals. And it was not a really nice neighborhood by virtue of the pictures he was drawing. And he'd sell them for $1 or $2. And today they're priceless.
Really?
The modern.
And born a slave.
Yeah, born a slave, and he did these fantastic drawings, and of course it's the trained artist who appreciates him the most.
What is it about these artists that make them special?
They're uninhibited. They break all the traditional rules of art school.
Such as?
Well, you have to draw between the lines. You know, you're taught as a kid, you have to stay between the lines.
That was always a problem for me too.
Well, I couldn't do it either. But they invent things. They're very inventive. And if for example, if they're doing a panorama of a sea and a lighthouse, as Alfred Wallace did in Cornwall, they don't know how to put a house in front of a lighthouse, so they'd alter the land so that the house was here and there, and sometimes you could see 3 sides of a house, which you can't do, but they would show you 3 sides as if the 4th side was very, very long. And it's just because they want to show the viewer what they see, but they don't quite know how to do it. And that's what makes it so interesting.
Well, didn't a number of them end up, at least at some point in their life, being institutionalized?
Some were institutionalized, and some began their art career in the institution. Eddie Arning, who was in Texas, he was a rather violent man, and like a lot of institutions, they'll give him some art materials to start. And he started copying ads, cigarette ads, automobiles, out of magazines, and he would copy them. Well, his drawings are sometimes so much better than the actual ad in the magazine. And I collected probably 12 or 15 of his works, most of which are in the museum now.
It fascinates me. I can't remember who it was, but one of the people you write about was really discovered by the psychiatrist in the institution.
The most famous American is Martin Ramirez in California, who was a Mexican worker who was just a day laborer, and for some reason he was picked up. He spoke no English, and they thought that something was wrong with him, so they put him in an institution. He had left to earn money, like a lot of Mexican workers do. They want to take money back to Mexico. But they kept him in the institution, and he was perfectly happy there. And he started drawing, and Dr. Pastow, who was a psychologist at a nearby college, recognized the brilliance of this man's work. And today, they are really important.
Who was Henry Darger?
Henry Darger was a Chicagoan. I happened at one point in my life to live 3 blocks from him, and of course I was a young boy, and no one knew what he was doing anyway. He lived in a large room in like a brownstone, and in that room he was writing the longest English novel ever.
Seriously?
Yes, 15,000 typewritten pages.
Good grief.
He wrote it first,
About
handwritten,
what?
and then he typed it on an upright typewriter. I've seen the typewriter. And it was about the good and the evil, the Glenda Levians and the Vivian girls. And these little girls, who were probably 8 to 10 years old, got into all kinds of trouble with these evil people, and then there were good people. And he told these stories in fantastic, just imagination. And then he decided he better illustrate it. So he had no idea how to draw. And he would just begin to draw how he thought it would be. And he didn't know how to make people, so he would copy from Grimm's fairy tales and other books. And then to make the right size, he'd take a picture of it, take it to the drugstore, get a negative, and ask him to make it to the right size, and then he'd copy that. So they're very inventive people.
Wow.
They have very little education, But it turns out his portfolio of drawings, some 400, some very small. Mine that I gave to the museum was 90 inches long, double-sided. So part of the story is on that double side of a 90-inch drawing that he made. And it was so small, his room, that he had no place to store all these drawings. So he put them on his bed, and he slept in a chair.
Tony, what got you involved with these artists? What was it that you looked at something and said, "Oh, I like that"? What was it?
I don't know. Maybe because I'm quirky. I'm sometimes known as the guy out.
I see.
He's the guy out.
You're a different kind of outsider.
Yeah, he's a little different kind of guy. He was the right guy collecting this work, though. But a friend of mine asked me to work on the Lakefront Festival years ago, and the next year I was the co-chair. I don't know how that happened, but I was the co-chair the next year. Well, I became fascinated. I'd always had a sense that I liked design and I liked this, but I never did any serious drawing. So I talked to curators, I talked to artists, I talked to fellow collectors, and I made a lot of mistakes. A lot of mistakes.
Like what?
Well, I bought work that really wasn't very good. My children have it hanging in their walls.
Well, they didn't get the inheritance of what you gave to the art museum.
No, we call it early dad art. You know.
I see.
But then I started getting more sophisticated simply by hanging around the Milwaukee Art Museum, and learned a lot from the people who are really, really good at this. And then I met a very good friend, now a very good friend in England, who was a dealer, and we had a little business together. They were doing some business, and he introduced me to the really great self-taughts. And I learned from Russell Bowman, our former director at the museum, and from my friend Alex Gerard, and from some others. How do you distinguish? And it's not something you could just go out and say this is good and this is bad. You have to study it for a long time. But I could go into a dealership and look at 25, 30 paintings, which dealers never want to do, or drawings, and pick out probably the best out of the crowd. And they just say that I have an eye, so it turned out pretty well.
And so you got involved with the Lakefront Festival of the Arts.
Yep.
What is it that makes that special, by the way? I love it.
I think the Friends of Art are probably one of our greatest volunteer organizations in the city. They raised a lot of money. They raise a lot of money for acquisitions and now for exhibitions as well. But it's a training ground. It's a training ground for leadership skills, for volunteering. I learned philanthropy from Rotary, which I was asked to join Rotary by a business acquaintance because of my work on the Lakefront Festival. And between Rotary, Milwaukee Rotary Club, and the Milwaukee Art Museum, it has shaped my life. And I learned philanthropy from both. And as a result, I did a lot of fundraising.
And you've done a lot of giving also.
But I do a lot of giving as well, in a lot of different things. My good friend Bernie Peck, that many people will remember fondly, who's now in Florida most of the time, helped me learn about philanthropy.
Yes, I keep telling Bernie I'm his son, but it
doesn't
doesn't seem
work,
to be
does
taking.
it?
No,
Yeah,
no, doesn't work.
But he said he too had to learn philanthropy, and he made a big impression on me. I've told him that too.
You mentioned acquisitions. How does a museum get acquisitions?
Well, interesting note, of major museums in the United States, 90% of the artwork was given by collectors.
Really?
Yeah, because you just don't have the money to buy the really important things.
Well, I was curious about that because you see things selling for
Yeah.
$40 and $50 million and up.
Yeah, that's really way out, way out. There are a few museums in the United States who have great endowment, in Cleveland and Philadelphia and so on. But still, the vast majority, the Milwaukee Art Museum, we have modest endowments for this and for this and for this, different kinds of art. But we really count on contributions.
How did they come to you and say, Tony, we'd like your collection?
I came more to them than they
Really?
came to me, because Russell and I started working together in 1990.
Russell Bowman.
Yeah, Russell Bowman. And all along I was saying, Russell, all things go well, the majority of this collection will come here. So Russell was very good about it. He also every year asked me, what are you going to give me this year?
The basic rule of fundraising.
But I did, in collecting, I tried to visualize how would this piece look with everything else I have in a museum. And an important factor is that with many artists, you can't just buy one. You could buy one Ramirez and get the idea, and one Henry Darger and get the idea of what it is. But with a lot of artists, you have to buy multiples, and that's one of the strengths of the collection that I gave to the museum. There are some I gave them 6, 8, 10 pieces by one artist, because when you're seeing an exhibition, if you just see one of an artist you don't know, you don't really know much about that artist until you see more of the work, and then
And yet you mentioned that with the self-taught artists, the outsider artists, their work doesn't change over their careers.
But there's different images, and they do different things. They're just creative, but they're doing their own thing. They're working in the same medium. Rarely do you see them work in any other medium. If it's a drawing, it's a painting, that's it. It's a charcoal or something, or a pencil. That's what they worked in their whole life. But if you look at Bill Traylor, I mean, he was such an interesting guy. Here's an illiterate former slave, and he made all these great drawings of animals and people and street scenes. So to appreciate Bill Traylor, you have to see a number of drawings.
I think of various museums, and I haven't all that much experience with them, but I think of the Chicago Art Institute, for example, huge collection of Impressionists, which seems to be a focus of theirs. Do we have a focus for the Milwaukee Museum?
Well, we do. We're essentially a contemporary museum. Now we go all the way back to, we're very early antiquities. But our strengths are Peg Bradley's collection, which was 19th and 20th century. A wonderful eye. She had a great eye, and she put together a great collection. Richard and Erna Flagg collection of German clocks, and then Haitian, which I never could figure out how Richard did, with this diversity, you know. And then we have a great expressionism. We have a great photography collection. So it's essentially our real strengths are, and then in the self-taught area, we have the Michael and Julia Hall collection, which was a typical American folk art. I have very few pieces that would be considered folk.
And the distinction being?
The distinction with folk is they are essentially people who are from the same ethnic area, same geographical area, and they're making utilitarian items. For example, in early America, before we had very many craftsmen, they made all the signs, all the sign painters, and the sign painters also became portrait artists before the photographer, before the camera. They were painting people's pictures. If you didn't have a lot of money, you couldn't go to Europe or import an artist from Europe. That's who did it. That's who did it for you. That's folk art.
Now, would that be, I'm just trying to place things, where would Grandma Moses fit?
Grandma Moses is kind of a borderline. She could be considered a folk art. She could be considered an artist. She was fairly consistent, and she certainly did her own thing. But I would say she leans toward folk art, or if I were talking about the Europeans, because my collection was 2/3 European, 1/3 American, I would call it naive.
Oh, okay.
Which the Europeans call that naive.
Now, you gave over 300 pieces.
Yes, 315 to be exact.
315, not that anyone counts.
No, who's counting?
Now, where did you have it all before it went to the museum? Where did you keep this stuff?
Well, I before I sold my company, I had a big corporate office. We had a lot of art there, and in my house. And then as soon as I sold my company in 2000, I had already arranged for a gallery in the 3rd Ward, and for 10 years I had a teaching gallery. And we had students come, and high school and college students. We had visiting groups. We had docents from all over the country. We had collectors. And then, after 10 years, they decided, well, let's give it to the museum, and so they took it and they closed the gallery.
Sylvia Levine or Levine?
Levine.
Levine.
Yeah.
Has a fascinating story, again, as all of your artists do.
Yeah. So Sylvia from Bristol, England. Alex took me to Bristol to meet Sylvia, and she was a hoot. Little green shoes, little house coats, and we got to her flat, as they say, and she invited us in, and she had a lot of her work displayed around the living room and the dining room, and some of them she just drove nails through them and put them on the wall.
Ah.
A delightful lady. I mean, very intelligent, and well, she brought out these black garbage bags, and one black garbage bag had nudes in it, another one had landscape scenes, and other things.
Garbage bags.
And then I started taking them out. Some were stuck together.
Yeah.
They weren't even in
Not
frames.
the best way to keep them.
No,
Folks at home, don't keep your art in garbage bags.
So I laid them all out, and I was just going crazy. I was like a kid in a candy store. So I wound up buying 7 that day and wound up with some 25 Sylvias, and we became good friends and correspondents.
Now, may I be really tacky and ask, what was the price range of those?
Oh, really expensive. Probably $200-300 a piece.
Really?
Now,
and,
Sylvia,
and today?
a very interesting thing. Well, there's not with some of these artists. There's not a secondary market.
Okay.
But with Sylvia, an interesting thing. She was judged into the Royal Academy show in the summer 7 times, and you either get judged or you can go on to the next level and be hung. She was hung 7 times. I have one of those paintings.
Really?
I didn't give it to the museum.
I was going to ask. Tony's most recent book is Art Without Category, and it's fascinating. If this interests you, and I can't imagine that it doesn't, take a look at all of these because they're just wonderful. How many books?
4.
4. Okay. And want to thank Tony Petullo for being here. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for being with us. As always, it's so nice to see you. Hope you will join us again next time as we continue to remember. Thank you.